Imagine trying to thread this rigid 20 millimeter plastic tube through a passage in your body that has suddenly narrowed down to, well, basically the size of a drinking straw.
Yeah, it's not a pleasant thought.
Right. And now imagine a doctor doing that essentially blindfolded, relying purely on the sensation of resistance in their hands.
Which is incredibly delicate work because 1 millimeter of miscalculation could lead to, a catastrophic rupture.
Exactly. And that is the intense mechanical reality we are exploring today. We are taking a deep dive into the meticulously engineered world of wire-guided bougie dilation, specifically the Savory dilation technique.
It's a fascinating procedure.
It really is. And to do this, we are grounding our entire discussion today in a fantastic surgical walkthrough. It's a YouTube video titled HCC 1.7538D Bougie Dilator with Wire, and it was uploaded by Gautamukala S. Raju.
Yeah, that video it's a great primary source.
It's incredible. So our mission here for you listening is to really unpack the physics, the spatial geometry, and the sheer teamwork required to safely stretch human tissue back open. Because whether you're prepping for a procedure yourself or you're just, insanely curious about how doctors navigate the twisting tunnels of the human body, this is a wild peek behind the medical curtain.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the procedure is basically a masterclass in applying mechanical force to biological systems. But before we examine the actual execution of the dilation, we really have to look at the structural reality of the strictures themselves.
Yeah, the blockages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're usually dealing with two very different physical presentations here. On one hand, you have simple strictures.
And those are the relatively straightforward ones, right? Like short and straight.
Yeah, short, straight, visually unobstructed. The classic presentation would be something like a Schatzki's ring or an esophageal web. Mechanically speaking, a Schatzki's ring acts almost like a biological drawstring. It's this concentric band of tissue that is just pulled tight, restricting the lumen, but it doesn't really alter the overall path of the anatomy.
So it's just a simple bottleneck.
Right.
But then the source details complex strictures, which sound far more treacherous. I mean, these are the ones that are extremely tight, heavily diseased, long, or highly angulated.
Yeah, angulated is the key word there. It's not just a localized drawstring anymore. It's this winding, narrowed canyon where the anatomy just twists and curves in completely unpredictable ways.
And navigating a winding canyon obviously requires a very specific toolkit. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because the analogy the source uses is basically like running cables along a conduit or, snaking a drain. They call it the railroad technique.
Which is a perfect way to visualize it. To physically stretch that narrow, diseased tissue, the medical team relies on the Savory dilation kit. And the foundational elements of this kit are the dilators themselves, these long, flexible, hollow cylindrical tubes. And they are manufactured in a highly specific range of sizes, starting at 15 French and scaling all the way up to 60 French.
Wait, the French scale always throws me off.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
But the increase in precise steps of 3 French, and in standard metric terms, 3 French equals exactly 1 millimeter.
Okay, so if we do the math on that, we are looking at dilators that start at a very slender 5 millimeters in diameter and then step up incrementally to a massive 20 millimeters.
Exactly. And that incremental sizing is the absolute key to the physical stretching, which we'll get to. But obviously, you can't just forcefully shove a 20-millimeter tube into a highly angulated complex stricture and just hope it naturally navigates the curves.
Right, it would just punch right through the wall.
Exactly. The dilator needs a track. Which brings us to the second component of the toolkit and the core of that railroad technique you mentioned. They use a specialized metal Savory guide wire. So you lay this thin, flexible wire down through the twisted stricture first, establishing a continuous path. Once that track is, perfectly positioned, the hollow dilator simply slides down over the wire, tracking the established path rather than forging its own.
But, and the source points this out, the physics of that railroad technique introduce a pretty massive friction problem, don't they?
Oh, huge.
Because you have two distinct moving surfaces interacting with two totally different materials at the exact same time. The inner tunnel of the plastic dilator is, aggressively gripping the metal guide wire, while the outside of the dilator is dragging against delicate, living human tissue.
Right, the mucosa. And overcoming those dual friction zones requires two entirely different types of lubrication. It's actually really clever. The medical team applies a heavy silicone oil directly to the inside of the dilator.
Oh, so that's for the wire.
Exactly. It creates this low-friction interface between the rigid plastic and the metal wire, ensuring the dilator doesn't, snag and pull the wire out of position while they're pushing it down.
And then for the outside of the dilator, they use a water-soluble gel, right? Applied with gauze.
Yeah, so it glides smoothly against the biological tissue without gripping and tearing the mucosa prematurely. It's a really brilliant dual lubrication strategy.
It is. But looking closely at the design of the guide wire itself, the tip initially confused me because the source is super adamant that the assistant must hand the endoscopist the end of the wire featuring this specific spring coil tip so that it enters the patient first.
Yeah, that's crucial.
But from a purely mechanical standpoint, you'd assume a rigid or like a slightly tapered tip would be way better suited for pushing through a tight, fibrous blockage.
Yeah.
A spring coil just seems completely counterintuitive. It seems flimsy.
It does seem flimsy, but, well, pushing a rigid metal wire blindly through a stricture is incredibly dangerous because of what lies immediately beyond the blockage.
The stomach.
The stomach wall.
Right.
The endoscopist is actively feeding this wire down into the gastric cavity. If the tip were stiff, the moment it made contact with the mucosal lining of the stomach, the forward force would just drive it straight through the tissue.
Oh, wow. Causing a severe puncture.
Exactly. So the spring coil tip is this vital engineered safeguard. When that tightly wound coil meets the physical resistance of the stomach wall, it inherently lacks the structural rigidity to puncture.
It just bends.
Right. It harmlessly deflects, it bends and glances off the mucosa. It basically transforms a potentially lethal puncture wound into a gentle, sweeping bounce along the greater curvature of the stomach.
That makes perfect sense. The tip is inherently forgiving. But, and here's the next issue, that forgiving deflection creates a brand new spatial problem.
It does.
Because if the endoscopist is pushing this wire through the stricture and the camera is eventually removed, they're operating entirely blind. How do they prevent themselves from just endlessly feeding the wire until it overcoils into a massive knot or, slips out of the stomach entirely?
Right. They need to know the exact location of that spring tip without subjecting the patient to, continuous real-time x-rays.
Exactly. So how do they map it?
The solution is a really brilliant application of external mapping. The guide wire itself functions as a physical depth gauge. Printed directly onto the metal, starting from that spring coil tip and moving backward, are distinct visual groupings of markings.
Like little lines on a ruler.
Basically, you have a section with 2 marks, then 3 marks, 4 marks, and 5 marks.
Yeah.
And every single mark represents 20 centimeters of distance from the tip.
Okay, so let me do the math. A 2-mark grouping indicates 40 centimeters. 3 marks is 60 centimeters. 4 marks is 80 centimeters, and so on.
Exactly. And the math here maps perfectly to human anatomy. In a standard adult, the GE junction.
That's the gastroesophageal junction, right? Where the esophagus ends and the stomach begins.
Right, exactly. That junction is located approximately 40 centimeters down from the incisors, from the front teeth. So if you were looking at the wire right where it enters the mouth, and you see the 2-mark section hovering there, that tells you exactly 30 centimeters of wire is inside the body.
Which means that spring tip is hovering precariously right at the GE junction.
Which is an incredibly unstable and dangerous position. Because if the tip is merely resting at the GE junction, it hasn't anchored into the stomach cavity yet.
Right.
And the moment the endoscopist attempts to slide a heavy dilator down that wire, the downward force will likely push the wire out of alignment. That causes the dilator to deviate from the center of the passage, and it could potentially pierce the esophageal wall. You need the wire to act as a deeply anchored track.
So seeing 2 marks at the mouth is a massive red flag.
Huge red flag.
Conversely, if you see the 4-mark grouping at the mouth, indicating 80 centimeters of wire has been fed into the patient, you have the exact opposite problem, right? You've fed way too much wire past the stricture, and that flexible spring tip is now overcoiling inside the stomach.
Yeah, which risks knotting the wire or creating dangerous pressure points against the gastric walls.
So what's the sweet spot?
The target is the 3-mark grouping. Seeing 3 marks at the mouth indicates exactly 60 centimeters of wire is deployed.
Oh, okay.
This means the spring tip has safely bypassed the 40-centimeter GE junction and traveled an additional 20 centimeters deep into the antrum.
The antrum?
Yeah, the antrum is the wider, lower portion of the stomach just before the pyloric sphincter. It provides the ideal anatomical cavern. It offers the necessary geometric space for the wire to just lay flat and stable along the curve of the stomach without kinking. That 60-centimeter depth provides the absolute perfect mechanical anchor for the railroad track.
But wait, the source specifically notes that the medical assistant is the one intently monitoring these markings at the mouth, not the doctor.
That's right.
Which I have to push back on that. The endoscopist is the one actively performing the physical dilation, pushing this heavy plastic tube in. It seems incredibly risky to offload the responsibility of monitoring the depth gauge to someone who isn't even holding the primary tool. Why aren't they watching their own depth markings?
What's fascinating here is that it all comes down to cognitive and physical load. The endoscopist's entire focus must be devoted to proprioception, the tactile feedback coming through their hand.
Oh, like feeling the resistance.
Exactly. As they grip the heavy plastic dilator and advance it down the wire, they are entirely reliant on feeling the drag coefficient and the subtle physical resistance of the stricture deep inside the lumen. Maintaining that highly sensitive internal focus requires looking away from the mouth. The division of labor is an absolute necessity.
So the assistant acts as the anchor for the entire procedure.
They really do.
While the endoscopist is forcefully pushing the dilator in and pulling it out, applying, significant pressure, the assistant must grip that lubricated guide wire and hold it dead steady at that 3-mark sweet spot.
Yep. If the assistant's grip fails and the wire slips inward, the track overcoils. If the wire is pulled outward, the deep anchor in the antrum is lost, and the dilator just becomes an unguided projectile inside the throat.
Wow.
The integrity of the entire railroad relies entirely on the assistant holding the line.
That is wild. But establishing that line in first place requires navigating the endoscope, the camera, through the narrowed tissue first. Because they don't just blindly feed the spring-tipped wire down the throat initially, right?
No. The endoscopist uses the camera to visually locate the stricture and then feeds the guide wire directly through the endoscope's biopsy channel. They thread it visually through the stricture and down into the antrum.
And the source highlights an incredibly elegant hack for the assistants during this specific step. Because the biopsy port on an endoscope is sealed with a tough rubber cap, right? Designed to maintain a tight internal valve.
Right.
If you try to forcefully push that delicate, tightly wound spring coil tip through that tight rubber slit, the friction can easily just permanently warp or ruin the coil.
It totally neutralizes its safety function.
Exactly. So to prevent this, the assistant takes a blunt syringe needle and pierces the rubber cap first. They leave the needle in place to act as this tiny, rigid, low-friction tunnel. The fragile spring tip slides perfectly through the hollow needle, bypassing the rubber valve entirely, and then the needle is simply pulled away.
It's just a brilliant micro-level engineering solution to protect the equipment. Small procedural details like that dictate the success or failure of the macro procedure.
It's so smart.
Yeah. And once the wire is digitally confirmed to be anchored securely in the antrum, the endoscopist slowly withdraws the camera entirely, while simultaneously feeding the wire forward to ensure it doesn't drag out with the scope.
Because they need to leave the wire behind.
Exactly. Now, while some endoscopists perform this wire exchange under fluoroscopy, using continuous X-ray imaging to visually track the wire, highly experienced practitioners frequently execute this exchange blindly.
Really?
Yeah, they rely entirely on their spatial awareness and the assistant's verbal confirmation of the markings at the mouth.
So, with the camera removed, the patient is left with just the wire protruding from the mouth, securely held by the assistant at the 3-mark sweet spot.
Right.
Then the endoscopist threads the silicone lubricated dilator onto the wire, applies the water-soluble gel to the exterior, and begins to advance it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Despite the presence of high-tech imaging and advanced polymers, the actual widening of the stricture is a profoundly tactile, almost artisanal process.
Artisanal is a great word for it. The endoscopist is feeling for the exact moment the leading edge of the dilator makes contact with the narrowed tissue. When that contact occurs, the sensation in their hands changes from smooth gliding to a sustained gripping friction.
And they just push.
The doctor must apply steady, even downward pressure to physically force the stricture open, stretching the diseased tissue. And the biological limits of the tissue dictate the pace.
Right, because forcing tissue open inherently causes trauma. You can't simply ram a 20-millimeter tube through a 5-millimeter opening in one motion without tearing the organ in half.
No, definitely not.
So the source outlines a fundamental mechanical limit known as the rule of 3 to manage this trauma.
Right. The rule of 3 governs the escalation of the dilator sizes. The endoscopist starts with the dilator size they suspect will pass easily, perhaps a 12 millimeter.
Okay.
If it glides through the stricture without registering any tactile resistance, they withdraw it, and the assistant wipes the wire clean. Then they load the next size up, a 13 millimeter. Still no resistance. They step up to a 14 millimeter. Suddenly, the endoscopist feels that distinct gripping friction.
Ah, so the dilator has finally engaged the structure.
Exactly. And the rule of three dictates that once the endoscopist registers that first instance of significant physical resistance, they will advance the dilator size a maximum of 3 more times during that specific session.
So if they feel resistance at 14 millimeters, they are permitted to dilate with a 15, a 16, and cap the session with a 17 millimeter dilator.
You got it. Stepping up 3 sizes ensures the stricture is meaningfully expanded, maximizing the benefit of the procedure for the patient. However, it's really important to note that the rule of 3 operates strictly as a safety ceiling, never as a mandatory quota.
Oh, so they don't have to do 3.
No, a skilled endoscopist is constantly evaluating the quality of the resistance. If they step up from 14 to 15 millimeters and the stricture feels incredibly unyielding, almost like hitting a solid wall, they will immediately abandon the rule of 3.
They just stop.
Yeah, they might stop after a single step up. The structural integrity of the tissue always supersedes the desire to achieve maximum dilation in a single day.
That makes a lot of sense. So once the final dilator is withdrawn and the assistant finally removes the guide wire, the physical stretching is complete. But leaving the patient at this stage would be incredibly negligent, right? Because instead of just assuming the structural integrity of the stricture held, they have to go back in and check the seams.
Right.
It's somewhat like forcefully stretching the fabric of a tightly tailored suit jacket. You know, you achieve the extra room you wanted, but you immediately need to inspect the stitching to ensure you didn't blow out the seams.
That's a great analogy. The endoscopist immediately reinserts the camera, the endoscope, to visually survey the site of the dilation. And the primary objective here is to inspect the tissue for adverse events. Because dilation relies on mechanical force to expand the lumen, it inevitably causes micro-tearing of the mucosa, the inner lining of the esophagus.
Just tiny tears.
Yeah, that micro-tearing is precisely how the tissue accommodates the new, wider diameter. Minor mucosal tears are an expected outcome of the physics involved, and they are the primary reason a patient might experience temporary bleeding or localized chest pain post-procedure.
Now, if you are sitting in your car right now listening to this and you're wincing at the idea of a 17 millimeter plastic tube causing micro tears in your throat, this brutal mechanical reality is exactly why the entire procedure is performed under heavy sedation.
Oh, absolutely.
But the endoscopist isn't looking for the expected micro tears, are they? They are hunting for deep mucosal tears.
Right. A deep mucosal tear indicates the structural integrity of the esophageal wall has been severely compromised, and the ultimate danger they're looking out for is a full perforation.
Which is?
A literal hole ripped entirely through the wall of the esophagus.
Oh, man.
Yeah. A perforation transitions the situation from a routine outpatient procedure to an immediate life-threatening medical emergency.
Because a full perforation means that the barrier separating the GI tract from the chest cavity is just gone. Anything moving through the esophagus, including normal oral bacteria or gastric juices, can freely leak directly into the chest, leading to massive infection.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, when you look at the devastating consequences of a perforation, the brilliant engineering of literally every step we've discussed today snaps into focus.
It really does.
Think about it. The spring coil tip exists solely to prevent puncturing the stomach wall. The precise 20-centimeter markings ensure the wire doesn't buckle and misdirect the dilator through the esophageal tissue. The assistant gripping the wire with unyielding stability keeps the heavy plastic tube perfectly centered in the lumen.
Yeah.
And the rule of 3 and the endoscopist's willingness to back off when tactile resistance spikes ensures the tissue isn't stretched past its absolute breaking point. The entire procedure is this layered system of engineered safeguards designed to prevent a single catastrophic mechanical failure.
It is a remarkable synthesis of spatial geometry, fluid dynamics, and intense interpersonal communication. I mean, we've unpacked how doctors bypass complex, winding strictures using a perfectly lubricated railroad technique. We map the internal geography using external wire markings, identifying that crucial 60-centimeter antrum sweet spot. We explored the vital division of labor, where an assistant holding a wire completely dictates the safety of a doctor working entirely by feel. And we examined the strict safety ceilings governing exactly how much force human tissue can withstand.
The entire process demands a profound respect for both the resilience and the fragility of human anatomy. It really highlights that the most effective medical interventions often rely on meticulously executed foundational physics.
So, the next time you take a simple sip of water or you comfortably swallow a meal without a moment's hesitation, take a second to appreciate the complex living plumbing operating just beneath the surface and appreciate the staggering mechanical ingenuity required to navigate and repair that plumbing when it begins to fail.
Well said.
But looking at the long-term reality of this procedure leaves us with a fascinating, almost paradoxical problem to ponder. We know that Savory dilation relies entirely on applying physical force to tear and stretch the mucosal tissue.
Right.
We also know that the human body inherently responds to physical trauma by healing the area with scar tissue. And biologically, scar tissue is significantly tighter, denser, and far less flexible than healthy, original tissue.
It is.
So could the very mechanical trauma required to stretch the structure open under the rule of three actually stimulate the creation of more dense scar tissue during the healing phase? Does the physical act of forcing the plumbing open inadvertently trap the patient in a recurring biological cycle where the healing process itself generates a newer, tighter stricture, virtually guaranteeing they will need to return for further dilation?
That's a huge question.
It is a complex paradox of applied force and biological healing. Keep thinking, keep questioning. Until next time.